Welcome back to Sikistan, and welcome back to the Sikistan Scientific Institute Dissemination of Information. This week's paper review is on the influence of foam rolling on recovery from exercise-induced muscle damage.
Are we the Ministry of Insemination?
No, dissemination.
Okay.
Of insemination of information. So this is coming from Salem State University. I assume that's the same one where they burned several witches, or
In Massachusetts?
potential witches. Is that Massachusetts? Massachusetts. They have their fax number up here for some reason. And this is from 2019, so that is that says a lot. Right, so this paper today is pretty interesting. We'll get more to it in the end. So coming off the back of the Joel Seedman video, we're talking about looking at actual individual scientific studies and how not every study is created equally, how not every journal is created equally, how not every submission to every journal is created equally. So today's paper has more wrong with it than right. There's a couple.
It's a bombshell.
It's a bombshell. There's a few things that we were arguing about before this for about half an hour, but ultimately we came to the same conclusion. And we're just going to run through a little bit of the study design, so real quick synopsis like we usually do, and if Fitz is going to get some results, and then we're going to start discussing the results. But Fitz is also going to read. Are you going to read some of what they're implying it
I
means?
think I might.
I think you should, because
Yeah.
it'll give a lot of context.
There's a lot of manipulation of data.
Intentional interpretation of that.
Yeah.
So the purpose of this study was to examine the impact of foam rolling, FR was the acronym they used, on recovery from exercise-induced muscle damage. The acronym they used for that is EIMD, and they've gotten to a stage where the acronyms are too far.
It's gone mental, lads.
Just going to start acronyming whole sentences.
It's not that difficult to write out actual words.
Yeah. So anyway, 37 males performed 40 by 15 meter sprints to induce muscle damage. Fucking hell. Immediately following sprinting, and in the 4 days following, perceived muscle soreness, hip abduction range of motion, hamstring muscle length, vertical jump, and agility measures were recorded. 18 subjects were in the foam rolling group, while 19 were in the non-foam rolling group, known as the control group, or CON for short. So there's a couple of nuances to what they did. Essentially, they had week one where they did testing. The foam rolling group did their foam rolling and their testing. That's important, what you need to know. And in the control group did their initial testing with no foam rolling. And in the following week they did more testing, and we stayed in the same groups. The same groups stayed in there. Whoever didn't do foam rolling the following week and part of their testing over a couple of days. And then the foam rolling group did their foam rolling over the couple of days of their testing. So that's basically the long, the short of the study. There's some kind of nuance about the foam rolling. It's quite long. They go through the areas they foam rolled. It's the lower body. Mainly what you need to know is they did a lot of sprinting to induce as much muscle damage as possible, which is totally fine, makes perfect sense. You just want to make sure you're getting some muscle damage, like we've seen with some of the hypertrophy or the recovery papers, where you just want to make sure you're getting muscle damage and to be sure you're getting something from it. So results, please, Mr. Fitzel.
The results, so there's a few different areas they looked at. First one is going to be physical performance, so agility tests and vertical jump. Then the next thing they look at is like muscle soreness or how beat up they're feeling like. And then the last one is actual range of motion. To get into the physical test first, T-test agility, I assume it's an Illinois T-test they did. What they're looking at here is they basically start off with a baseline. Every time it goes like a second above that baseline, so in their multiple tests throughout, I think there's around 5 or 6 tests, that would obviously pull us up to 1 on the graph. You imagine that 1 would make a triangle with the bottom line, and they look at area under the curve. So every second or every fraction of a second that's added that is perceived to be due to fatigue or due to lack of recovery is put down to that kind of lack thereof recovery. In the case of the control group, that area under the curve was significantly bigger than it was in the foam rolling group, and this is pretty much the extent of their kind of statistical analyses. They did a Man-Whitney T-test. What the fuck? I was right the first time. Man-Whitney U-test, just to compare the two of them, and they did have a significant finding. The interesting thing here is that they're looking for like minimum significance difference. So it's not a very strong finding. It's by no means a conclusive finding on this agility test. I think the other thing that's interesting with agility tests we'll probably get into later is that there's an awful lot more factors go into an agility test than something like an isometric strength test, or a simple range of motion test. So there's obviously a certain amount of skill element, there's reaction time element, there's a stretch shortening cycle element to it, and we'll definitely get into that a small bit later on. Next test they had was vertical jump. So a vertical jump test, in most cases, they just get you to drop down. You do a counter movement jump where you drop down and jump up as you would in any normal application. In this case, they got you to drop down and pause for a second and then jump up. This deviation from the norm is slightly askew with kind of what you'd expect to see in a paper. No significant difference in the vertical jump outcomes though. One thing they do discuss here is that the lengthening of this amortization phase, so the amount of time they're paused in the bottom, has limited the stretch shortening cycle. In application, in a scientific lab setting, a lot of the time that doesn't limit the use of a stretch shortening cycle, because you'll get someone to pause in the bottom and then just as they get to go again, they kind of dip down and jump again, or they'll have a small little bit of a stutter as they go, and there will be some element of stretch shortening there. But the important thing to note at this point is that there's no difference in vertical jump between the group that did the foam rolling throughout their training week and the group that didn't. Next, we had tests for kind of hip abduction, different ranges of motion. We don't need to get into too much of this because there was no change. Foam rolling didn't show us any significant difference between the group that foam rolled and didn't foam roll. It's not like they were kind of getting stiffer over the course of the week and foam rolling stopped that stiffness. It's not like foam rolling improved those ranges of motion because nothing happened different from the control group. The last thing then is perception of soreness. Perception of soreness was found by using a simple testing battery. It's named in the paper. There is no difference in perception of soreness between the foam rolling group and the control group. I think one thing that would have definitely made this element of the study an awful lot better is if you got the control group to do something akin to foam rolling. So moving around on the floor, something that's quite kind of not physically demanding but certainly proprioceptively demanding, where you're rolling on something. It's a bit of a skilled movement, and those kind of things can alter those perceptions of soreness, particularly perceptions of delayed onset muscle soreness. So I think that would have improved the quality of the study a small bit more. But the most important thing, once again, to note is that there's no difference between foam rolling and non-foam rolling.
Okay, so we've got the results of the study. What do you want to
go into?
I'm just going to talk about what they're saying first.
Okay.
So there are the results there. We saw basically no difference in anything up until the agility test, where they saw a statistically significant difference, but everything else didn't change. So no range of motion, no vertical jump improvement, no perceived soreness change, and yeah, that was it. So I'll just read you their practical application bit at the end. So during recovery from exercise-induced muscle damage caused by sprinting, foam rolling may benefit the recovery athletic attributes related to the stretch shortening cycle, such as agility. Conversely, foam rolling during recovery from exercise-induced muscle damage caused by sprinting does not appear to be effective for improving muscular soreness beyond what a vigorous dynamic warm-up can accomplish. The enhanced recovery of agility measures may have a significant implication for athletes to engage in sports that require rapid deceleration, acceleration, and change of direction, or COD if you wanted to call it something like that. Practitioners should consider using foam rolling during recovery from demanding exercise when the need for peak agility or change in direction performance is imminent. Further foam rolling appears to be a beneficial tool for recovery regardless of the type of exercise performed. Practitioners should encourage the use of foam roller by athletes recovering from demanding exercise. Acknowledgements. Performance and Health, Hygienic Corporation Ohio supported this project with donations of foam rollers. So if you
say there's a bit more than the foam rollers donated there.
I saw myself and Dara, we don't buy really, because importantly there's a line in theirs, and I'll just run to it there at the end. So those results in the study, or these results as you would be saying here, stand in contrast to the present investigation where no differences between foam roller and control were observed in other studies. So 3 other studies where they saw no difference between foam rolling and a control group who didn't foam roll, which stands results with a lot of anecdotal evidence, with a lot of the evidence in other studies where foam rolling just doesn't really seem to do anything in terms of performance. Not to say that there's no use for foam rolling, but in terms of increasing athletic performance and certainly in increasing recovery, it doesn't seem to do much.
No. I think one thing to look into here, right? So if it is, they just call it a T-test for agility. It's probably the Illinois T-test would be very, very commonly used in this case. we spoke earlier about there being certain things that go into a T-test besides like your physiological readiness, so how recovered you are from a previous session. The first thing is how skilled you're actually going to be, right? So if, take the back squat example, if Gerf has a 290 kilo back squat and I have a 50 kilo back squat, Gerf getting better at his back squat by 5 kilos over the course of a week is going to be significantly more difficult than it will be for me to improve my 50 kilo back squat over the course of a week. In the case of these two groups, you get the control group at 10.6 seconds average for their Illinois T-test, the foam rolling group 11.6. So you're around a 10% difference there in actual efficacy, like how good they are performing the Illinois T-test. Obviously, for that control group to be able to pull out off higher and higher times or lower and lower times or even more consistent times over the course of a week could be more difficult than a group that could be perceived as less effective at the test. So there's more variance in that foam rolling group. The second thing is a lot of the agility stuff isn't just down to kind of physiological readiness, so like the muscle tissue being ready. A lot of it is down to reaction time. A lot of it is down to actual ability to place your feet effectively. So it's central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, readiness. All of these things come into an agility test, and it's not really a good test for muscular recovery. You know, when we have a muscular recovery tool, or a tool that could be kind of poised as a muscular recovery tool, the Illinois T-test really isn't it for that case. The second thing is when you're looking at these studies, you really do have to look into that little sentence Gerf read about Performance Health Hygienic Corporation providing support for the study. This study shows the same thing every other study does, right? Besides the T-test, to be honest, most other authors probably just didn't include a T-test for the reasons we've just mentioned. The other studies are very similar to this, right? Similar kind of design, similar kind of things they're looking at. When they present their data, the data show what these data show, but it's written in a very, very different way. It's non-effective, doesn't have effect, effects are null and void, whatever it is. They don't suddenly say it may be useful, or they don't suddenly look for a kind of minuscule place where foam rolling might be used and then keep pushing your paper constantly on that. One thing to note is when they're looking at the T-test or the agility test and trying to poise whether it's the stretch shortening cycle is being activated here and it's the stretch shortening cycle is being recovered quicker with the foam roller, that doesn't really go along with the other data. They did find one paper that showed the recovery of stretch shortening cycle can go outside of the normal recovery pattern for muscle tissue. So in a cold water immersion test, we got people with a stretch shortening cycle quicker recovered than they would without cold water immersion. But it is very important when you look at the language of this paper that there's clearly something awry here. There's clearly something going on here, and it's in the second last page of the paper. It kind of becomes obvious why.
So like if you were to example say it improves players' agility and then you had noticeable differences in hip abduction, hamstring length maybe, and muscle pain and perceived muscle soreness, then I could see why maybe then your agility would be a little bit better. But if all the other values in both groups don't really change significantly from the groups themselves, and then suddenly one value is changing, you probably want to be looking at that in context. So this is kind of the gripe I always have with, for example, p-values used in studies like these or in terms of like sports science. You don't really, unless you have to put things in context in a lot of regards, especially when it comes to like practical applications, because usually these papers do provide practical applications for coaches. So putting things in context I think is very, very important. And for example, looking at this, it is important to put in context. So if you're saying, if you look at the group's difference in agility, like Fitz mentioned, one group is clearly just better at the agility test, the T-test, and we know that there is magnitudes of difference between increasing every second by second in terms of agility. So the foam rolling group were worse by the looks of things on paper at the agility test, so it's just easier for them to get a little bit better at that. And then the likelihood is they probably didn't have done a lot of T-test or agility work prior to this, so it's, you know, they're getting more practice at this, and it's probably what would most likely see them increase their ability at that, especially when there's no change in other values that they tested in this. So I think probably what happened as well is not so much that there was a load of evil scientists in the lab at the university, and the students were like, okay, we're going to make sure we're going to push this somehow. What probably happened was like, oh shit, we're getting free stuff from this company. Probably, we don't know again, of course, but it kind of looks like that in reality when you look at the study as a whole. Like typically what you'd see, for example, in papers are often very, very cutting, especially when it comes to finicky tools. So normally what you'd see in this title would be foam rolling does not improve any performance factors. They'd be very definitive with the title. You'd see it in loads of papers, whereas this is a very definite title. There was some student researchers in this they mentioned as well, so it's probably just they felt somewhat obliged. If you were to ask me, if you had to put a gun to my head and you said, why do you think they presented the results in this way, and it's likely because they just had a little bit of obligation, some kind of social obligation. Universities love getting free stuff, and they'll never say no to free stuff because universities love free stuff the world over, and so it's hard to kind of reject free stuff.
Yeah, it's also important to note as well that the papers where nothing happens are the papers that don't really get published too easily. Like this is published in the National Strength and Conditioning Association's journal, the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, and this is a great journal to get published in, right? A lot of the stuff we commonly look at gets pulled from there. Most kind of bigger papers are looking, if in the area of strength and conditioning obviously, are looking to get published by this. The null and void or nothing happened here titles don't get published. They're not flashy, they're not good. They want titles that people are going to click on. They want titles of papers people want to read. And so there's more pressure as well externally coming from the fact that you don't want to write a paper that won't get published.
What I probably would have preferred to see was the difference between groups. So the same group, the differences between those. So rather than everyone having their group and then you're foam rolling the first week and you're foam rolling the second group, well, I think it would probably been a little bit more useful, and it would have negated some of that magnitude of change between the agility t-test where the good people were finding it harder to get better. What I think would have been better if everyone started off the same, then you split them into their groups, and then you could see from 0 with no foam rolling, or you continue to not foam roll, you'd see those differences. And I think that would have been a little bit more of a interesting result for a study, and maybe a little bit more useful.
Absolutely.
Thanks for watching. Until next time.